You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space. Almost forgot what we were called there. And for the next 60 minutes, we are going to be talking about Doctor Who Flux, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Hi, I'm Mark.
And so it's time to go back and talk retrospectively about Flux, which I'm sure we've all watched over and over again now so that we can really get a handle on what it's all about. And which I'm sure has had plenty of time to settle in our nostalgia bones. So we've got plenty of time to assess it in the context of the whole of Doctor Who. And I'm judging by the look on Matt's face, that is entirely not true, as I was fully expecting it not to be. Let's do the listener comments, because there's quite a few and fewer when we get to the actual episodes. And for the benefit of anybody who's not seen one of these before or listened to one of these before, this is our listeners poll. So what we've done is we've found out the order that our listeners liked the episodes. We're going to start with the one they liked the least and work our way up to the one they liked the most so that we can finish talking about something that hopefully we'll all have enjoyed. Gordon Rennie says, it was, by the end, a fairly wretched experience. Phil Markham says, excellent middle, good start, but weak ending, although the 6-part serial format worked for me, and hopefully RTD continues it. Jeff Waddell says, seeing as I wouldn't score any below 8 out of 10, easily my top ranking season since the show's return. Can't see what the negativity is all about.
Let's find out.
Well, yeah. Ian Martin says the structure worked brilliantly. The performances were good, but Kel Surprise, the writing didn't add up to anything. It didn't stick the landing, and it unravelled like a comfortable but frumpy old woolly garment. Oh, and episode 3 wasn't even drama. Rod Brown says, overall, a bold experiment that was hugely enjoyable, albeit overly complicated for a casual Sunday night audience. Jodie clearly gave her all, and probably her best performance. Mandip's Yaz was also well served, and John Bishop proved a very engaging actor. Chris Denton says, I think Flux is really best considered as one story, not 6. Jimmy Twizzle, so he didn't vote at all. Jimmy Twizzle says, a big improvement on the first 2 Jodie series, but requires a second watch. George Machin needs a rewatch when the Blu-ray comes out, but Flux had such a solid start and then really lost its way for me in episodes 5 and 6. Steve Herr, for the first time since series 4, I was excited for every episode. Pause for JR to groan. I loved most of it, forgave the flaws of an obviously truncated story and cast, and also invested time in explaining the plot to my casual viewer friends who could not remember, who had not watched the last series. Luke Hammond. Perhaps my view will change in time, but right now, aside from the Angels and Sontarans episodes that were very entertaining and pretty cohesive, I don't really give a fig about the rest of this bunch. I'm perfectly capable of following dense plots if I'm engaged, but when they are complicated for complication's sake, full of sci-fi exposition dumps and aren't anchored by having relatable people in thought-provoking situations, I just don't care. Mind you, I'd say this was probably about as thought-provoking and relatable character-wise as most of the rest of Doctor Who, so who knows. At the risk of inviting JR's wrath by adding a third sentence, Jodie's out-of-breath delivery and incessant waving around of the sonic screwdriver continue to irk me as well. I don't disagree with him on that score, really, especially the out-of-breath delivery. Oh. Ian Barclay, fun story, looked amazing, already missing Jericho. Richie Lamond says another 2 episodes, one on the Liverpool tunnels and the other on the Great Serpent, could have taken the overall story from good to great. Pat Howe says really enjoyed it overall, but too much going on. A bit less action and some more character time would have helped. I liked the format. David Kitchen, I don't really have any comments which aren't obvious or weren't covered on the Doctor Who show Hot Takes. He says, in an absolutely astonishing bit of self-advertisement. Unbelievable. Mark, have you anything to add to that?
You'll hear my thoughts on Flux in about 2 years' time when we do it on the Time Lash, which you may want to listen to.
Is that the ever current and on the ball?
Yeah.
Actually, 2 years is probably a good gap to actually talk about these things.
Yeah, we don't like this instant reaction nonsense. It's just
You
not
have
for
to
me.
let it mature like a fine wine, or manure,
Exactly.
depending on
absolutely.
your opinion.
Ian Charles says, there's only two more after this. I said holding up three fingers. That's including this one. Ian Charles says, I enjoyed the Flux. It entertained me, and I was able to follow what was happening, which many complained they couldn't. I didn't maybe find it completely satisfying or as tied up as cleverly as I hoped. It may also have benefited from some streamlining of the story strands and fleshing them out. James Courtney, there are some quite bold sci-fi ideas at the heart of this series, with the war between space and time, but it doesn't quite cohere. I can't help but wonder if you could recut this series into something better. Either way, it was worth it as an experiment. It's the most I have enjoyed the show since Moffat left. Would love for them to do a serial again, although not for each series, as we can't have a Doctor with only 3 stories to their name. And finally, Matthew Maisie says, I loved them all to one degree or another. Fab season. Slightly too condensed at the finish, but I was still gripped. Mark, as will have become apparent to the listeners by this point, we are missing Simon, and you are here in his stead again. When I invited you to come and sort of join us as a sort of occasional guest host at the start of December, I wasn't imagining, but by the end of the month, you'd have appeared 6 times.
Is that right? Good God.
Yeah. I'm starting to think that you turned up on our Christmas Eve episode with COVID and passed it on to Simon.
It's starting to sound like he genetically engineered the Omicron variant himself.
Yeah, I know, right?
Right.
I worked out a way to transmit COVID via Skype. That's what I've done.
They're Donald Trump supporters. You're quite wrong about Bill Gates and Fauci.
But seeing as you're the one who wasn't on the 6 review episodes with us, and I don't want to push you too much because you'll have time to consider your thoughts, like you say, before you get onto it on the Time Lash, which actually is probably only going to be in a few months, isn't it? You're quite quickly catching up.
We are actually, yeah. I think we've got a couple more left of Series 11. Yeah, we'll be catching up soon and then have nothing to do, so that'd be nice.
Yeah, that's going to be terrible. That's one of my 2 favourite Doctor Who podcasts.
We'll figure out some shift in the format. I don't know.
As long as you don't start talking about Big Finish, because not that I have anything against Big Finish, but to listen to an hour-long review of something that I've not heard, so I wouldn't be able to listen to many of the episodes, I'm afraid. But at the risk of getting you to sort of preempt what you're going to say somewhere down the line, overall, what did you think of Flux? Just an overall thought before we get stuck into the story.
I mean, I really enjoyed it, I've got to say. It was quite great to be excited for Doctor Who every week in a way which is no slight on the previous series, but it had that kind of feeling of event television again, which I don't think the show's really had for a fair few years now. And that includes kind of Moffat and Capaldi era as well, all of which I've enjoyed. But so yeah, it was great to have that kind of 6-part serial. And I do think there's a bit of a slightly patronizing attitude to audiences from Doctor Who fans who I beg Doctor Who fans to watch any other television. Honestly, please do, because other people do. And it's all long, drawn-out storylines that you have to pay attention to and return to each week or each year or whatever. So it was quite refreshing to see Doctor Who finally go back to being a serial again. And I think mostly it worked. I think it left a few things dangling, which I hope will be resolved in the specials, but I'm not optimistic that they will be.
Rewatching episode 6, I was left with the impression, because everybody was saying, the universe is still destroyed by the Flux. How is this left dangling for the... And I'm watching episode 6 again after I've read all these comments. And from what I could make out, episode 6, aren't you supposed to come away from that with the impression that Ood still up on the division station between the universes is fixing the universe? Doesn't he say he's going to put it back together and try and get it as accurate as he can, but he says, forgive me if I don't get it back exactly as it was. I could be
Okay.
wrong, but I'm sure that
'Cause-
was the yeah.
I thought that you'd had reduced the ferocity of the flux, so that whatever was left, and so that you could house the flux energy within the passenger, and that the rest of the universe would be kind of kept intact, but whatever was gone was gone. But now that you've said that,
Maybe.
maybe that's actually what happened.
He
I've
definitely
also
says
heard-
something about he'll keep it as, I can't remember exactly what he says. Something about I'll make it as accurate as I can, or something like that.
There is
Okay.
something in maybe Doctor Who magazine which I haven't read because it hasn't been posted to me, because for some reason the postal redirection doesn't work for Doctor Who magazine. Royal Mail.
Christmas. Maybe if you got it readdressed so that it was sent to your address in the first place.
Since September.
You're supposed to get in touch with the Panini website and
Yeah, I know, but I've forgotten my login and part. Anyway, I heard a rumor that it says in there, or I read somewhere that it says maybe in there, that loose ends from Flux are going to be picked up in the New Year's special, and that includes the Doctor going around kind of fixing things a little bit.
Maybe, yeah.
So there's possibly a bit of that she's sort of.
Because I did wonder, because one of the other criticisms was that the TARDIS, whatever was going on with the TARDIS, hadn't been resolved. And obviously the promotional artwork for this is a cracking TARDIS. So I was like, well, that's fine. That'll presumably, maybe that's what's causing the time loop. Who knows?
Maybe, yeah. But then also the other thing about that is the TARDIS she flies the TARDIS into the Flux to stop the progress of the Flux, right? Which surely damages the TARDIS. And the TARDIS being a time machine, we've seen before that the way it works when it's damaged is it gets damaged back through time as well. That's how Stephen Moffat did it in series 5. And so I don't know. When that strand wasn't developed, I just assumed that was because of the crash with the Flux. So I don't know. There are all these things which people say have been left, and I'm thinking, well, some of them may have been left. Others may just have been resolved, but you're assuming, because we've all watched Stephen Moffat for 8 years, you're assuming that these things are going to get picked up.
Possibly.
Yeah, who knows? Shall we? Well, Matt, before we go any further, now that it's been a couple of weeks, have you anything more to say about the series as a whole, other than where we left it?
Not really. I mean, I'm still upbeat about certain episodes and nonplussed about other episodes. Thinking back, there are 2 or 3 episodes in this series that I really just can't remember what happened in them, and I think that's not because I think Mark's right that normal viewers probably don't get confused in the same way that Doctor Who fans do, because they don't care about the sort of the fast-paced dialogue. It's only Doctor Who fans all Doctor Who fans are doing a podcast now, that they have to watch carefully, and they know they're going to have to explain what happens and explain the plot threads and how this connects up with Terminus or Arc of Infinity or something. And that's where the confusion comes. I think that kind of, it doesn't hold up to deep analysis, but that's all right. But my problem is it doesn't hold up to my memory, which suggests that in some episodes there's strong imagery that I can remember the Doctor turning into a weeping angel and this and that happening. Others, they just sort of blur into one a little bit, and unfortunately, quite important episodes in this series kind of blur into one a little bit.
But then it is a 6-part story, and I think apart from the Sontaran and Angels episodes, I think the other 4 episodes very much were 4 parts of the same story, weren't they? It's not like a Stephen Moffat thing where, say, The Impossible Astronaut, Let's Kill Hitler, the Demon's Run episode, and Wedding of River Song were all really distinct from each other. Actually, in this, the Halloween Apocalypse, Once Upon a Time, Survivors of the Flux, and The Vanquishers were all pretty similar to each other. They had distinguishing factors, but I thought they were pretty similar. And actually, if you took the other 2 episodes out, those 4 would have looked like, for all the world, something like Line of Fire, I guess, where each episode has kind of got a distinct sort of plot that carries on, but then the story itself carries on through, and all of the episodes kind of fit together as a sort of coherent whole.
Line of Duty, but I think, do you mean Line of Duty?
What did I say?
Line of Fire.
Oh,
And
right.
actually, I agree about the Line of Duty comparison, but the problem is Line of Duty takes place mostly in interview rooms.
Yeah,
And that's
true.
fine because it's a police drama. These mostly take place in this chamber or that chamber or this piece of corridor, and it's Doctor Who. So if Doctor Who isn't like memorable and different every week, then that's when I start to sort of, I don't know, I want to be able to remember the individual episodes, the individual journeys.
Yeah, I can.
But then is that?
So, yeah.
I've been wondering about this. Is that just because of what we've had the past 16 years? Because I mean,
Yeah.
I wasn't. Well, actually, I mean, I say I wasn't, but I was. In the 90s, when I first started watching Doctor Who on the BBC repeats, it was weekly, and I would tune in each week, and it would be a serial, and the story would kind of build up in that way. I think since DVD or UK Gold omnibus repeats, and then obviously the new series, we seem to be very used to Doctor Who being this kind of self-contained story each week now. So to kind of go back to its roots of kind of being a serial, I found the response from a lot of Doctor Who fans a bit bizarre. That, you know, or they couldn't follow it, or it doesn't. This episode doesn't stand up on its own 2 feet. It's like, well, no, because it's part 2 of a 6-part story or whatever. It's just an interesting aside.
Yeah,
but I find it quite strange.
The homogeneity, I don't mind so long as that homogeneity is something, you know, spectacularly visually exciting, or there's something going on. And half of this season, I thought that worked, and actually, some of them. So I don't think it's all 4 episodes for me. It's just maybe 2.5 that I think kind of blended. I can't tell what bits come from this episode and that episode.
But I think, in terms of the sort of visual sort of impact of the episodes, I think all 6 of the episodes had a lot of really interesting and impactful visual stuff. But then I think, and this was maybe where the problem is, and this has really started becoming apparent, I think, in Once Upon Time, in between the spectacular shots and the interesting location stuff, you tend to get very long scenes set in chambers and corridors. And that's because it is Doctor Who, and it is done to a certain budget. You know, Marvel could do the same thing.
And COVID's restrictions as well,
and COVID, yeah, absolutely. Marvel could do that, but they'd have the money to do it, you know, very, very differently. Doctor Who's been doing it like that ever since, you know, Russell T Davies. You know, we just reviewed the Christmas Invasion. The last 25 minutes of the Christmas Invasion is 2 scenes in 2 locations, or 3 locations if you count the outside of the spaceship. Doctor Who's been doing that ever since it came back, and of course it did it throughout the classic series. So I think to complain about this series doing that, the thing that Doctor Who has always done, it's just that because it's a serial, like Mark says, for the first time since the 1980s, I think that's become more apparent.
Yeah, possibly. I know that that's what Doctor Who generally does, but in the past, I found it quite memorable. So they've done things with that format that's stuck in my head. So the Christmas Invasion, I remember very vividly, and that might be repeated viewing, or it might be nostalgia, or it might be performances. Maybe the performance, David Tennant's first performance, maybe that stands out for me.
Yeah.
I don't know yet, because I need another 2 years for this to kind of bed down. But at the moment, thinking about it right now, because it's serialized, I find it difficult to actually remember what took place in the Time one, Once Upon Time, and what took place in The Vanquishers. But I know exactly what took place in Village of the Angels, War of the Sontarans, and the Halloween Apocalypse.
Let's get into the episodes. In 6th place, on 11%, so that's a very low score, Andy Massey says, "Oh, come on, throwing the watch down a hole. Give me a break. I am surprised the Doctor didn't wink at the camera." Although he votes it 5th.
Wrong.
Yeah, well, see, Matt and I had a different feeling about this from almost everybody else. So I'll do the other comments and we'll talk about the episode. But let's talk about this then, as soon as Andy Massey's brought it up.
Yeah, screw the listeners. Let's talk about our views.
We'll get the other listeners. We'll get to them. But let's talk about this one particular point, because we talked about, was this being set up so that Jodie Whittaker can confront the memories that are held in the watch later, or actually was this brought up in order to say something about the character not needing to confront the past in order to carry on, but enabling the character to say, I don't care what my past was, it's who I am now that's important, and that's what the character always has been and always will be. And is that why they've done it? And they've put it there and left it there in order for somebody else to bring it up, should somebody else in the future come up with a good enough storyline. I don't know, Matt, as we left it, you thought they were going to leave it.
Yeah.
There's been a couple of weeks since we talked about it. Have you changed your mind?
No, and I had a spat with the Australians a little bit on Twitter. Because one of the problems the Australians have with this is that it was built up as being she's going to find out, she wants to open it, and then she doesn't open it, and it's an anticlimax. But actually my argument is, yes, it is built up as this really tempting bit of knowledge that she wants to find out. She's like an M.R. James archaeologist. She wants to know what's happening under the surface. She wants to find out. But there's that scene where she's basically persuaded that this is dangerous, tempting knowledge, and she doesn't need to know what's in the watch because it's presented as a choice between the knowledge, her getting the knowledge that's in the watch, and her losing her friends or destroying the universe and flipping into a new universe. And she realizes, I think, in that scene, and this is one moment in Chris Chibnall which isn't outlined clearly in dialogue in the internal monologue, or she doesn't say, I've suddenly changed my mind about this watch. It happens actually in the performance and in the way it's framed and filmed, that this watch flips from being this object of desire that she wants to open to being this actual threat that if it opens, she'll suddenly stop being the Doctor, or she'll be a different Doctor, or she'll lose her innocence. It's the Garden of Eden thing. And from that moment, she really only wants to open the watch in a moment of extreme crisis. So my view is she doesn't. We were talking about Survivors of the Flux, I think, and we were predicting that she wouldn't open the watch because it had started being this dangerous object. And I thought she would never open the watch. Actually, when she drops it down the hole and says, I need this only in the extreme circumstances, I think this could be a regeneration story thing where she sort of unleashes a kind of a war doctor persona in order to defeat something big, and then the regeneration kind of resets it. Because I think she's had the dark Jodie Whittaker Doctor. We've seen the dark coated Jodie Whittaker Doctor throughout this, and I think that's something that could come back. That's a you're on film. Sorry?
Yeah, it's not coming back.
I think it might, because I think...
No, they've said it's not coming back. The costume designer said they threw the costume away.
Okay, well, maybe not the costume, but that dark Jodie Whittaker, the personality. Because that's so the flip of the 13th Doctor, that to have that kind of sudden, ruthless kind of warrior Doctor played by Jodie Whittaker, it seems that would give her something to really get her teeth into in her last episode. And so it might not, but that's my current feeling.
We're definitely going to run out of time before we actually talk about the episodes, but at the risk of running out of time, Mark, what are your feelings on The Watch? Do you expect us to see it again before the 3 specials are out?
Well, let me get us back on track. I completely agree with Matt, to be honest. I think you're absolutely bang on.
We lost cricket, but
I wouldn't be surprised if it does feature in the regeneration story, but equally I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't. I think you're right. It's a temptation thing. That's what it's always been. And I think, yes, you can argue that the Doctor's technically in the exact same position that she was at the end of The Timeless Children, but actually she's not. She has access to that should they want it. And that's an interesting conflict to have. So,
and of course, Doctor Who's when Doctor Who does address the character of the Doctor, it's very often about putting the character back in the exact same status quo as existed before. 5 Doctors, Day of the Doctor, 3 Doctors even. They're all about reinstating a status quo that's always been the status quo. So I didn't really see this as any different. If she opens that watch, potentially she could turn into a character who's not the Doctor that we recognise. I don't imagine that would happen, and obviously no showrunner in their right mind is going to make that a permanent change, right? They could do it for a story, but they're not going to do it for any longer than that. Something like I suppose Waters of Mars could be the result of opening the watch. But I think the whole storyline with the watch has been like the Day of the Doctor, in order to say, no, this is who the Doctor is, and it doesn't really matter. Nothing else really matters. Who the Doctor is who the Doctor is. That was the whole point of Time of the Doctor and Clara's lines to the Time Lords when she gets the regeneration cycle. Matt.
I think it's some fans who want to open the watch rather than. I don't think they have a problem with the Doctor not opening the watch, but they want to see what's in the watch. And the reality is, we've already seen what's in the watch. We know what's in the watch. There's not going to be a surprise. The only interesting thing would be seeing how Jodie Whittaker performs, having opened the watch. That's the only thing I would like to see. But the actual information, there's nothing there. It's a red herring.
Well, I joked on another podcast that what's
other
inside
podcasts. You're not
I know,
allowed
right?
Other podcasts.
But the watch will keep Big Finish in business for years and years and years to come. So that's fine.
Alistair Thwaite votes The Vanquishers 6th and says, by no means awful though, probably more a victim of high expectations after a strong season. Ian Charles basically agrees. He votes it 6th, says, whilst it was last for me, it wasn't too far behind the rest of the series. Best of the Chibnall finales, in my opinion. And Jason Wilson says, I thought they were all good episodes, so to be bottom out of them is not too shabby. And yeah, I think the instant reaction to this was people throwing up their arms and saying, oh, Chris Chibnall's wet the bed again or something. But I think the considered response is probably more, so it didn't quite stick the landing, but then when does the last episode of a 6-part Doctor Who story ever quite stick the landing? And for my money, I thought it was engaging enough and it was satisfying enough that it was fine for me. I think I voted it 4th or 5th rather than sort of like 6th, but it wasn't one of the better episodes of the season by any stretch of the imagination, but it was very much not a terrible episode of Doctor Who for me. Mark, what did you think of The Vanquishers?
I was kept entertained throughout. I do think it had a lot to do in sort of wrapping everything up. I don't necessarily think it stuck to the landing, but as you say, Doctor Who never does. But I think just stuff like, I was just kind of putting myself. I'm going to rephrase that because I was almost went down a very dark road. If I had seen that as a child, I should say, rather than I put myself in a child.
You went there anyway.
I went there anyway, had my cake and ate it. I would have loved it. I would have loved the image of the Sontarans and the Cybermen and the Daleks all converging and then getting absolutely annihilated. Like
3 Doctors.
It's just 3 Doctors, all that stuff. I think for kids it would have been an absolute joy to watch, and I think we do sometimes forget what Doctor Who fundamentally is when we pick it apart for podcasts and essays and Twitter threads and things like that. So I think there's problems with it, but I had a good time with it, and it resolved the story in a satisfying enough way. I felt a bit sorry for Dan, but I'm sure he'll get a happy ending at the very end, I hope. But not like that, man, honestly.
Matt, speaking of forgetting what... Go on, Matt.
What, you want my opinion on it?
Absolutely.
I agree that children would love it. I don't really care about that because I'm not a child. So I'm happy that children would love it. I think that last place is probably quite a fair place for it to be. Not because I don't think it was the worst episode, but I think because it's a 6-part episode, you also have to judge it on where it is in the story. And as a climax to the story, I think sticking the landing, yes, I know that other 6-part Doctor Who episodes didn't stick the landing, but this is 2021, soon to be 2022. You expect sort of fireworks in the last episode. I didn't get fireworks for me in the last episode. Yeah, and if I was a child, I'd be blown away by that. But as an early middle-aged person, I was kind of slightly confused by that. So I think it was fine. I seem to remember voting most of these stories fairly evenly, bar 1 or 2. So I think there's a sort of a kind of a middle ground. So I was satisfied with a lot of them. But if you are going to rank them, then I think that a finale that doesn't stick the landing, that's probably the biggest crime a final episode can have.
Mind you, I don't think any of the Russell T Davies finales stick the landing either, but those are a different kettle of fish, and one that we'll be coming back to in due course, obviously. In 5th place, on 31%, Survivors of the Flux, which I think overall, actually, this is probably the one that should have come last. Not that I didn't enjoy it, but I think it's the one that achieved the least in some ways. So here's Jonathan Bloom on Gallifrey Base posited a theory a few days ago, and now I'm going to have to try and go back to this theory from memory, and I can't remember exactly why he came up with this theory, but I do know there was evidence to support this theory, including, I don't know if you saw in some of the early trailers, but there was a piece of dialogue in Village of the Angels that suggested it was going to be set on, and I can't remember what the dates were, but let's say November the 29th. And in the end, it went out on November the 22nd, and there was the dialogue changed in the dub that changed that from 29th, as it had said in the trailer, to 22nd. And in the episode itself, it said 22nd. There was other evidence as well that Jonathan Bloom found, which suggested that originally there had been due to be another episode in between Once Upon Time and Village of the Angels, and actually, therefore, either Survivors of the Flux and The Vanquishers was one episode, which Chris Chibnall stretched out to 2, or maybe, possibly, and this was my suggestion, that it actually was going to be a 7-part series, which in the end, the BBC said to Chris Chibnall, could you possibly do as an extra episode for October 2022 for the centenary? And Chibnall said, well, the only way we can do that is by losing an episode of Flux. And so I think what happened is Flux went from 7 episodes to 6 episodes. There was an episode lost in between Once Upon Time and Village of the Angels. And because that episode was lost, I think the shape of Survivors of the Flux and The Vanquishers probably had to change, because I think some of the material that was in Survivors of the Flux would originally have been in the episode that was between Once Upon Time and Village of the Angels, which is my long way around the houses of saying Survivors of the Flux for me was probably the least satisfying. I think there was a lot of stuff in it to enjoy, and I still think it was a very engaging episode, but overall for me, yeah, it was slightly less satisfying. Matt, what do you make of all that?
I think it makes sense, because the serpent stuff, the unit serpent stuff, would work better after Once Upon Time if it moved on to, so he's in Once Upon Time, and then I love the unit stuff and him manipulating unit. I love the sort of world cruise that they go on to try and find something that it doesn't matter what they find.
See, I think Survivors of the Flux would have been more about the cruise, and as you say, the unit stuff would have been in the original episode 4. So yeah.
I mean, where the Doctor fits in all, I mean, the Doctor's position in Survivors of the Flux is the weakest bit, because that is she's sitting in a room getting a PowerPoint presentation. But this, I would still rate this higher than others, because it's episode 5, and in the logic of Doctor Who's always done this, episode 5 has always been the padding episode, and if we see this as the padding episode, as padding goes, this is pretty good. I mean, it goes places and does things. I think some people might mark it down for doing things to unit that shouldn't be done, but I quite liked the stuff that they did to unit, and it kind of makes sense in my head, even if they don't express it out loud in the series. Once again, I think Chibnall's done something bizarrely without outlining it really clearly in the dialogue again and again, which is, this is a guy changing the past of unit, bringing it into formation earlier with a different person up ahead, demoting the brigadier, somehow manipulating, or they can't stop Kate Stewart getting to the top at some point. So I don't know. There's some sort of untangling there that maybe that's a result of a condensing of the episode. Again, the weird thing about this whole series, I can't tell if it's overly padded or it's had lots of stuff cut out, so it's too short. It's either too short or it's too long, and I can't quite decide which way to go. There's something not quite right with the amount of content in it, which is understandable considering. I mean, as far as it goes, if this is an emergency series that's been chopped and changed and shuffled around, I think it's worked remarkably well. But you can only review what's in front of you. So,
speaking of which, Mark, what were your feelings on Survivors of the Flux and the idea of it having maybe lost an episode somewhere along the way?
I think it's probably actually lost a few episodes. I do feel that this is, as Matt says, an emergency season. I do think there's probably a 10-part version of Flux somewhere out there, where maybe Village of the Angels and the War of the Centaurs were much more standalone than they actually are. I think that's probably what's happened. I think in terms of Survivors of the Flux, I think it sets up the finale really well. It brings in, like Matt says, this kind of alternate history of UNIT that either fixes UNIT dating or completely throws it out the window again. However you want to take it. It introduces the idea of the multiverse. This idea that we're going to blow up the Doctor Who universe and just start a new one, and you can come with us and learn all your past, or you can stick around and try and save this doomed one. I think that's such a great character moment, and I think it's like we were talking about with The Watch. I think I am much more into the bit in The Vanquishers when Azure says to the Doctor, that's your greatest fear. It's not yourself. It's the destruction of things or something like that. I much prefer that as a characterization of the Doctor than this kind of dark, mysterious hero, that has this myriad of origins and labyrinthine history. I don't care. There's somebody that saves the day. And I think there's a lot of good stuff in Survivors of the Flux, but I do think I remember when the cliffhanger kicked in, just going, I don't know how this is all going to get tied up at the end, because it feels like it introduces so much more stuff as we're in the kind of the final stages. And so I think just because of what it does and because the fact that it doesn't kind of pay off, I think I think 5's a fairly a fairly good position for it.
There's a kind of a paradox in that there are some people complaining that the Doctor doesn't find out about her past and this information isn't revealed, but they seem to be the same people who have a real problem with the Doctor becoming this dark figure and having all of this past revealed. So I can't quite work out whether some people want this information revealed or want the mystery to be kept there, but they seem
Doctor Who fans never know what they
both at the same
want.
time.
There is a thing where, and we will talk about, I think we'll talk about this at another juncture, who knows, maybe before the end. I think there's a thing where some people hate the idea of change, but at the same time are excited by it. And I think also some of the people who are excited by the idea of change don't actually like that change necessarily when it comes. So I think there are all sorts of paradoxes going on there. And I think that's part of the psychology of being a fan of something, especially of a thing that finished and then started again, because the very idea that it finished makes it feel like a finite organism. And when it begins again, then it loses that finiteness after that finite quality has had time to settle in your head. So I don't know, maybe
you also I think you also have a bit of entitlement as well. There's definitely a feeling, certainly in Doctor Who fandom and a lot of other fandoms of things that have disappeared and then come back again, that we kept the flame alive. We're the reason the show's come back and become this massive success. You should pay some sort of tribute to us and you should respect us. And as Russell T Davies says, writing is not a democracy. It's, the show is in the hands of the person who has their hands on the show, and they take that show in the direction they want to take it. And you either get on board with it or you kind of depart from it in a way. And it's a difficult decision. I get, but
the sad fact is the people that did keep the flame alive, which I'm not one of them, although I bought New Adventures. The people who feel like they're owed something because they kept it alive in the 90s, they're not a substantial part of the audience, and they're not something that a successful television series should aim towards, because otherwise you just end up with Bill Baggs DVDs on screen, and that's it.
And I completely disagree with the idea that this was what kept Doctor Who alive. Virgin sold a couple of thousand copies of each of their books. That's not what brought 9.5 million people to the TV movie in 1996.
Commercially not, but it did incubate creative talent.
Yes,
of which Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat weren't really part of that, but the other writers and Mark Gatiss and Paul Cornell.
Yeah, but look, as you point out, all three of the showrunners we've had have not been a substantial part of any of the things that were going on in the Wilderness years, because they're all busy actually making television instead. In fourth place, on 37.9%, it is Once Upon a Time. And I can't remember who it was made that comment about it not being drama. I think it was Ian Martin.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a terrific idea to have these, and it was a terrific idea that was obviously written as a result of COVID and as part of the COVID protocols, to have these same three characters basically hopping in and out of one another's memories, essentially, so that basically you could have a three-hander and yet it be taking place in all sorts of different places and all sorts of different times. I didn't think it was the greatest episode of Doctor Who there's ever been, but I did think, for an idea that you patently came up with because of what was going on in the real world, I thought it was a terrific piece of television, really. Mark, what did you think of Once Upon a Time?
About the same, really. I mean, it's definitely not one of my favourite episodes of the serial, but I think it's quite creatively done. I think it's, just that idea of, as you say, taking the core cast and just having them play other people within other people's memories, I thought was grand. You get a little bit more insight into what kind of doctor the fugitive doctor was, so that scratches that itch for some people. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but I mean, it's a good sci-fi idea, but it does feel, as much as it kind of throws light on the fugitive doctor and Dan's backstory and things like that, it does feel a little bit kind of like the kind of middling sort of middle of the season episode of something like Star Trek: The Next Generation, where we'll do like a weird time paradox episode to use some of the same sets and some of the same actors, and we won't have to spend too much of the budget.
To which point, I think Once Upon a Time would have played much better in a 10-episode series, at sort of fifth or sixth episode into a 10-episode series, than the midway point of a 6-episode series. I don't know, but what do you think, Matt?
I think I agree mostly with Ian Martin, for the reason being, I think it is an interesting concept, but they use this interesting concept to reveal information and to dump information as a vehicle of exposition, rather than as a vehicle of progressing the story or putting characters into severe jeopardy or physical jeopardy. It kind of blurs all that together, so it becomes a sort of a series of kind of trailers for things to come up, or sort of snippets that don't quite connect together. So I think this was my least favorite episode of this series. But again, in number 3, in episode 3, in the middle of this, sandwiched between two more standard conventional episodes, maybe that's a kind of an experiment that's worth having. But
I think so, yeah.
But I think it does fall into the Chibnall issue of being a PowerPoint presentation. So he uses this to just show you, or tell you mostly, what's happening, rather than actually doing something dramatic with it.
In third place, we'll talk about the 3 good ones now, shall we?
Yeah.
On 57.2%, Andy Massey, I love this comment, he votes it 4th. He says, this is like emptying out a box of Subbuteo pieces onto a green baize before starting a game. Alistair Thwaite says he votes this 1st. the most engaged I've been with an episode since World Enough and Time. And I say that as someone who has liked most of the Chibnall era. Obviously, it's the Halloween apocalypse, which I think, retrospectively, looking back on it, I think is very much of a piece with things like Survivors of the Flux and Once Upon Time, in that it's got all of these things happening at the same time, and we'll keep sort of flittering backwards and forwards between storylines. But I do think it's quite an engaging and quite a impactful, for want of a better word, way to start the series. There's so much going on. It's so frenetic. And yet you do also feel like you're getting to know lots and lots of different characters. I don't know. I think for a Chris Chibnall series opener as a 1 of 6, I don't know. I think the Halloween Apocalypse is pretty good. Again, not greatest episode ever by any stretch of the imagination, but for all the sort of paper plates it's got, at the top of sticks that it's trying to keep up in the air, I think it basically does. And I think it's a pretty impressive feat, really. Mark, Halloween Apocalypse.
Yeah, I loved it when it went out. I think it's. Sorry, I must admit that I haven't watched all of these more than once. No. But this one I did.
And also, we surprised you by being on this episode tonight, because you came along to talk about something else.
Yes, indeed. But yeah, I thought it was great. I thought John Bishop was fantastic as Dan, and I think one of my criticisms of Flux is that he very quickly becomes a stock Doctor Who companion after War of the Sontarans, which is a shame, because I think he was bringing something that had been missing in Doctor Who since, I would argue, Russell T. And it was something that only kind of struck me the other day when I've started watching the Eccleston stuff again. And I was like, oh God, like that's what we were getting with Dan. It was this kind of much more grounded, contemporary Earth character that really feels tangible and real and relatable for an audience. And then aside from all that, you've got the universe exploding and a weeping angel on Halloween and the Doctor and Yaz dangling upside down from like weird space ankle cuffs. It was great. Just, yeah, brilliant. It was a really good, strong Doctor Who season opener that, again, I don't think we've had in a long old time, really. Really attention grabbing. And I remember the kind of, that kind of vibe you get off Twitter at the end of an episode. People were mostly positive, which was nice.
Yeah. In fact, that was the case. My sort of overall impression of the reaction through the series was that for 4 weeks, lots of people were saying, well, I wasn't expecting to like a Chris Chibnall season, and yet here I am against all odds enjoying a Chris Chibnall season. And then when she got to episodes 5 and 6, the very same people were saying, there, you see, I told you.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah, I think this was the sort of exact midpoint between a frivolous, insubstantial but fun Russell T Davies season opener and a substantial and anything but frivolous but nevertheless still fun Stephen Moffat season opener. I think this was frivolous and substantial at the same time. Matt, what did you think?
I think this is one of the episodes that has strengthened, in my opinion, having watched all 6, partly because it works as a series opener. You're right that it's starting to spin plates, because that's what an opener should do. An opener should be putting the Sabutio figures on the green baize. An opener can get away with just having like introductions to various things, because you have the trust that they're going to bring these things together later on. I have to say that it's easier to start spinning plates than it is to continue spinning plates, or to come up with a good spinny plate finale that doesn't involve the plates falling off. So I think creating a good episode 1 is probably easier than creating a fantastic episode 6. But having said that, you judge what's there on the screen, and it was good when it went out, and it remains good. It hasn't been corrupted by anything that's come since.
In second place, on 73.1%, and this was the one that's the most standalone, because I don't think the other one that looks standalone is remotely standalone at all, given what it ultimately turns out to be about. But this one, War of the Sontarans, obviously, I don't know, just really enjoyable. A lot of fun, very funny, and at the same time, quite exciting. I don't know, as I've said, Mark, throughout the course of the reviews, not just this year, but throughout the whole of the Chris Chibnall era. Something about the production of it. I think they've leaned into making it look pretty and like prestige drama at the expense of that Doctor Who quality that Russell T Davies brought in, that Stephen Moffat followed through on, which is that sort of kind of cheesy quality. I think when Chris Chibnall leans into the cheesy, it's at odds with the production, so it doesn't quite work. And so for me, War of the Sontarans is an episode that just doesn't quite get there, but so close to almost that I just really enjoyed it. And yeah, second time through as well. Mark, what did you think of War of the Sontarans?
I kind of disagree with you. I think there's something quintessentially Doctor Who, but about this, the Sontarans in the Crimean War.
Oh yeah.
Rendered as a prestige drama. That's insane. And like for Doctor Who to be attempting that in 2021 during COVID, I think fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. There's life in the old dog yet, and all that kind of thing. I thought Jonathan Watson was absolutely superb as the Sontaran commander, and I hope we see him back in future Sontaran episodes, because he's definitely, I think, an actor who grew up with the show as a child and knew exactly how to pitch that performance.
And yeah, according to him, he'd never seen a Sontaran episode before.
Really?
He says so. He says he didn't even take direction on it. He just chose a performance and went with the performance that he chose, apparently.
He used to work with Peter Capaldi's wife on City Lights. He definitely seen the Time Warrior. Come on. But no, I loved it. I thought it was really good. I thought, again, it kind of does what the Halloween Apocalypse does, is that there is a lot of other stuff going on around the kind of core alien invasion story, but I quite like the kind of bridge between contemporary Earth and the past Earth, and you kind of see how the alien timey-wimey plot is actually affecting contemporary Earth, rather than just having the Doctor and her companions in that moment trying to prevent the future. That was quite a nice thing that I don't think we would see all that often in Doctor Who. So yeah, it was lots and lots of fun. Definitely probably my top, possibly my favorite actually, rather than Village of the Angels. But it's a very close run thing. Very close run thing.
Matt, War of the Sontarans.
Yeah, I agree with Mark that this felt more quintessentially Doctor Who than Chibnall's usual historical stories, which I like. I think this series is missing a Rosa or a Demons of the Punjab, which I kind of regret, because I do like that sort of po-faced, sincere historical, but at the same time I kind of prefer the Witch Hunters or Witchfinders. And this one, I think that sort of irreverent history works much better as a Doctor Who story.
Plus, you would never have been able to fit a Rosa into this season, would you?
No, it would have got swamped. I mean, this is where I think Mark's probably right, that there is a version. There's probably a 10 episode version of this, a 7 episode version of Flux, a 6 episode version of Flux. We'll probably find that there's a 3-part version of Flux somewhere, just in case of emergencies. I like the fact that the Doctor actually gets something to do. I like the fact that Dan gets something to do. I pity poor Yaz being given the traditional Doctor role of being in rooms having things explained to her. But it's fine, because that's Yaz and not the Doctor. I think it's more important in this case that the Doctor actually gets out and about and does stuff. And I agree. I like the way that the 2 time zones were sort of connected together. I found that quite pleasing, because that sort of happened without me. I wasn't expecting it, and then when it started happening, I didn't realize it was happening. And it's only as it halfway through I realized what they're actually doing. And the Sontarans as well. I worried that Chibnall was going to grimdark the Sontarans and make them a real unlikely threat, but actually he got Dan Starkey in, and Dan Starkey did his comic Sontaran, which I really like. And I think Chibnall quite successfully managed to make the Sontarans kind of a threat, but without reducing the comedic value that's been ingrained in them since the very beginning, because the Sontarans had never really been a massive threat.
In first place, then, on 96.6%, So it's very high, but not quite, 100%. Obviously, Village of the Angels, which I think is terrific. And I think what's really terrific about this is the way it is a piece of the jigsaw rather than something else that just sits in the middle of the season, not really being a part of the season. Because I think a lot of people look at Village of the Angels, and a lot of the comments I've seen and heard about Village of the Angels almost suggest it's an episode apart from Flux, but it really isn't. Village of the Angels really is an integral part of the overall story, I think, and it's the fact that it's mostly set apart from the location hopping that you've got in the rest of the series that kind of makes it feel apart from it. But even then, you've got Yaz and Dan in one time zone and the Doctor in another, so it's not entirely different from War of the Sontarans in that respect. But yeah, you can sort of see what the Angel story might have been if it hadn't have the Flux elements in. But by the second half of it, when you're starting to lean into all the division stuff, there's no way this could have been anything else, really. But it's terrific. I mean, no argue from me that it came first. It's obviously, I think, the best episode of the season. Although, as Mark says, perhaps very closely with War of the Sontarans. Matt, Village of the Angels.
I don't think it's that close with War of the Sontarans. I don't agree. I don't think this is very Fluxy at all, or I don't think Flux is interwoven into this. The division is towards the end, and there's sort of callbacks to the division, but the revelation of the division doesn't happen until the start of the next episode, where you realise what the Angels were being used for. I mean, there's bits of Bell and Vinder.
This story wouldn't have happened without that division stuff. Just because they don't start talking about the division until later, you wouldn't have had that angel and the other angels looking for that angel if it hadn't been for the division. You wouldn't have had the 2 times. No, you could have had something else. But what I'm saying is they integrated the story into Flux really well.
I fairly strongly feel that the original Village of the Angels didn't have the division in it at all, and it was just angels doing stuff in Devon, causing time slips and causing weird things to happen, and the division stuff was sort of slotted in towards the end. But besides the point, far from getting into an argument about the undeniably best story of the season, I liked it. I didn't think the division stuff distracted from the fact that this was a story mostly set in the 1960s. It had atmosphere. It had a real sense of location. It had good twists going on. It had a really good cliffhanger. It looked good. It was well performed. All the regular characters had something to do. They didn't get taken into a room somewhere to be talked to. They all actually ran around doing things. There was likable, sort of really well performed supporting characters, and Jericho is one of the best characters that's been in a Chibnall story, certainly, and possibly for a while. I can't remember Moffat having created such a likable supporting character for a number of years. So I think
partly also to do with the actor, isn't it?
Yeah. So the actor and the character work well together. So yeah, this is one of my favourite Chibnall, not just my favourite of this series. It's one of my favourite Chibnall stories, and possibly, it ranks up there quite highly with Moffat and Russell T Davies stories as well.
What do you think, Mark?
I mean, I agree with Matt in the sense that sorry, JR, but in the 10-part or the 7-part or whatever part version of Flux that there was originally, I think this was a Maxine Alderton Weeping Angels in a Creepy Village story that is then sort of retooled to be a kind of main shift in the overall Flux plot. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both in terms of what you guys are saying. However, I think in terms of the Weeping Angels,
the traditional Simon position.
Well, I am replacing him.
Not
forever. So
Starting to feel that way.
Well, look what happens when we coexist. No, but I think in terms of as the Weeping Angels in particular, I think it's the sequel to Blink that I would have wanted, because I think the actual sequel to Blink, and Stephen Moffat said at the time, is it's aliens to Blink's Alien. And I've never really liked Aliens because it just kind of fundamentally destroys what I love about Alien, which is the creepy abandoned spaceship, this single creature stalking the crew, and it just becomes like there's a bunch of soldiers and there's loads of weeping angels and there's action, and it just doesn't quite work.
Yeah. I'm
This
with you on that.
absolutely just builds on Blink. It goes, well, what's scary about the angels? The fact you can't take your eyes away from them. And it does take that element from Flesh and Stone, where it's like, you know, the image of the angel can itself become an angel, and does really interesting things with it. That bit where the Doctor tears up the pages, throws it into the fire, and then a flaming weeping angel comes out of the fireplace. It's all really great stuff. And I think, and then obviously just having them as agents of the Division and this kind of quantum, what was it again? A quantum recovery, not a quantum recovery squad. What was it again?
Yes, and yeah. Yeah.
All that kind of stuff that kind of builds
quantum extraction.
That's it. Builds a mythology and gives you a much more interesting take on these creatures, which, you know, at the end of the day, it's Grandma's footsteps, you know, rendered as a Doctor Who baddie. I really, really enjoyed it. And of course, Kevin McNally's great. I didn't call the twist, well, if it was a twist, the little girl being the old woman that goes, it happens again, even though, of course, she is.
Yeah.
You know, I thought she was Claire, not Claire. What's
I know who you mean. The main woman.
The main woman. Yeah. Got her name now. I thought Claire. It was like maybe she was. Was it Claire? I thought Claire.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. For some reason, I thought Claire was the one Dan was chasing. But I can't remember.
That is somebody else.
Okay.
Oh yes, the names have all gone out of my head now.
Well, I was right the first time. That's good. But I thought it was her, and she's been kind of buffeted around by the angels, and that was what the reveal was going to be. So yeah, it kept me on my toes. That final 10 minutes is just amazing, and for an episode 4 of a season of Doctor Who to be that kind of big and exciting and leave you wanting more is really great. It's I think I've come around, and yes, it is my favorite until it's not, and it's one of the sometimes.
Fair enough.
Good choice.
Yes, this was a series of Doctor Who that worked differently from anything we've seen. All those arc stories that Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat were doing in one way or another, they, with the possible exception of Series 6, they never really leaned into telling a story across the season. And even in Series 6, you had a bunch of episodes in between that were distractions from the main plot rather than continuations of the story. Series 6, I have sat down and watched the 5 Moffat episodes and enjoyed it as a story in its own right. But even then, it still doesn't work in quite the same way this does. And this really did have fandom every week coming back wondering what was going to happen next. I wonder, and I have wondered in these podcasts, if that's somewhat at the expense of the general public, because I do wonder if maybe some of this is a bit high concept sci-fi heavy. And yeah, Dan's there to offset that, and some of the other characters are there to offset that, but I still wonder if it's ended up a little bit too sci-fi for some of the general public.
I mean, my girlfriend watched it with me every week, and she hasn't done that. We've been together for 5 years. She's never done that.
Wow.
And you know, all the stuff like with Ruth and all that kind of thing. She was just like, well, I was like, do you know? And she goes, well, she's clearly just a previous version of the Doctor, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think there is things in there that I think, you know, we live in a postmodern society, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in the other thing that I actually came here to talk about.
That people will have already heard.
The people have already heard. We do live in a postmodern society, and people have watched a lot of television and have read a lot of books and have seen a lot of films. And I think there's certain concepts within Flux that I think people are probably quite familiar with.
I think there's I think we overstate that a bit sometimes, as we've discovered, because some of the viewing figures for Netflix and Disney Plus have come out of late. And actually, it turns out that the series that we thought was being watched by half the country had been watched by about 500,000 people. You know, a fraction of the people that are watching Doctor Who. So I do wonder if sometimes these concepts aren't as widely recognized as we think. And you talk about your girlfriend, but the thing that you can't forget, of course, is that she's sitting down to watch it with you. and she for 5 years has been with you, so she's kind of absorbed by osmosis
Perhaps.
these concepts in a way that, say, a couple who don't watch Marvel movies and don't watch, The Mandalorian or whatever, or WandaVision or something, won't have absorbed. So yeah, I think it's
Although
on
she
the
doesn't watch
borderline.
any of those things either.
No,
we're going to see
but
Spider-Man tomorrow, and that's like
Oh,
her
wow.
limit.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
sort of Spider-Man, but yeah. So I take your point.
We're
Matt,
talking about multiverses.
Yeah, well,
A
yes.
phenomenal number of people have watched Spider-Man, and that is, as
Yeah,
I
yeah.
understand it, which I haven't seen it. I understand that multiverses are quite important to the to the movie of
Yes.
Spider-Man, and has as much kind of complexity and knotty callbacks as anything Chibnall's created here. And that really is. I mean, Netflix, maybe, the viewing figures are overstated, but the people going to the cinema and paying a lot of money to see Spider-Man is undeniably a great amount of money around the world.
True. Yeah, yeah. But then again, £20 million, say, at the English box office is still a fraction of the number of people who sit down to watch Doctor Who every week. So I don't know. All I'm saying is I think it's a slightly grayer area. But speaking of the sorts of things that we've been talking through the episode, there are a couple of comments I've saved at the end because I thought we might just have 5 minutes talking about this. And given that Mark's with us, so he's gives us a perspective from another podcast again, this might be interesting. Because Steve Herr said, as an aside, this season has led me to cull the amount of podcasts I listen to. I don't mind listening to negative reviews, but I was getting increasingly frustrated at the total lack of balance and fairness. Even when praise was given, it was given begrudgingly, and often with a "this might have been good, but next week's better not be rubbish" attitude. At least he still has us and Radio Free Scaro, he says, to look forward to each week. On the time lash as well, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, because I mean, Ben and I had a chat before we started doing the Jodie Whittaker ones, and we're like, look, that's not what we want to do.
No.
We don't want to be, because I mean, I think both of us had kind of cooled towards Doctor Who a little bit, but we were like, we can't just every week just talk about how much we don't like it. And actually, what we found rewatching it is actually we like it quite a lot. And I think actually not to blow our own trumpet too much, but I think the Jodie Whittaker ones that we've done so far have been some of our best podcasts, actually. Some of the most interesting discussions. We've even had one of the writers on. That's how good it's been.
Look, Mark, before you go any further, I'll tell you the other comment, and I'll give you the context for it, because I think this other comment sheds light on what Steve Herr is saying. And I think it's where some podcasts differ from others. And I think there's a reason for it, which I'll bring up. And I don't think it's a deliberate reason, but I think it's one of those inherent things, an attitude that some people either have or they don't have. But David Kitchen says, by the way, I would have been fine if JR had named me in his funny story about the podcaster talking about the as yet unborn child line. I thought it was amusing and a good point, because what had happened was he had been on the podcast with Rob. Rob had said to him, "Oh, what do you think of the fact that Belle's pregnant?" And David said, "Oh, is Belle pregnant? I didn't realise that," even though she talked about the as yet unborn child, while at the same time pointing to a as yet unbirthed tummy. And he hadn't picked up on that. And again, actually, when they were reviewing episode 6, there were a couple more things where I thought, yeah, I tell you what one of them was when not Claire, Dan's girlfriend ends up inside the passenger.
Diane.
And then Diane. That's it. And then at the end of the episode, she escapes from the passenger, and the Doctor uses the passenger to absorb the flux. And David is like, aren't there millions of people in there who are going to be destroyed when the flux comes in? And I was thinking, no, they've already said twice that the passenger is empty, because Azure and Swarm used the people who were inside the passenger in order to power their batteries that they used in order to get to the ship that the Ood is on, the division ship. And then we see Diane inside an empty passenger. So it couldn't be clearer that the passenger's empty. And yet David still thought, oh, millions of people are going to die when the flux goes in. So the point I was coming to is not that David's stupid for not realizing this, because, when you look at something, you might watch things too closely in order to pick up on all the information. But this is what we do when we're fans. We look at things too closely in order to really absorb what's going on. So somebody who's not a fan, who's not watching it for a podcast, doesn't get to the end of Flux and think, oh, but they've not put the universe back together, because they see Dan back in the library and they just say, oh, they've put the universe back together. And if they need more evidence, you've got the Ood saying, oh, I'll try and put it together as accurately as I can, or whatever the line is, if indeed that was what he was talking about at the time. Point being, as fans, we're looking for all the little things. Sometimes we miss the big things, but also within that, I think that some classic series fans come to the modern series with a sort of unconscious sense of suspicion. In other words, because going back to what I said about the classic series being finite because it finished, and the new series being something that restarted, there's a certain amount of, for want of a better way to describe it, imposter syndrome. I think some new series fans, some old series fans, watch the new series with this suspicion that it's an imposter. And I don't think this is a deliberate thought, a conscious thought, but I think it's a subconscious thing that people do. And I think the point is, this makes them watch the program looking for it not to make sense, if you see what I mean. So they see problems where other people see answers. Do you know what I mean? Matt,
I think it kind of ties into what Matt was saying. Oh, I think we all went out of sync.
No, you
or
go.
I went out of sync with
That's
you
right,
guys.
you go on.
No, it kind of ties into what you were saying at the start, Matt, when we were talking about, everybody has a podcast now. And everybody's in a rush to get out what they thought of the latest episode of Doctor Who. And I think in that rush, there's things you don't pick up on because you're looking in another direction, and I try my best when I watch Doctor Who now, because Ben and I do, it's the new Who watch through, so we're not gonna do Flux immediately. I think I'd just let it wash over me, like on the first viewing, and I'll maybe just send a tweet, and that's it. Like, I don't need to. Sorry, but I don't need to record a half-hour chat or whatever, straight away, because I just think I just don't think that's the way to watch things that you enjoy.
I think,
well, yeah.
I don't know.
I'm more defensive of that kind of stuff, because I did listen to some of the Australian podcasts, the instant reactions, and I can see a place for instant reactions, and instant reactions that miss things and are kind of like just sort of taking it in, because I think a lot of their listeners will be people in the same position. They won't be the general audience who let it wash over. They will be fans that are trying to put things together and are excited and who know about backstories. And so they are actually speaking to those fans. So they're making mistakes, but that's actually part of the whole point. That's an instant reaction. And then they have a kind of a season, like we're doing, a season review where they kind of let it mull for a bit longer, and then they'll probably come back in 5 years' time to have a sort of a nostalgia take. And I kind of respect that, and I think they do it. It's fine if they've missed lines of dialogue. That's actually interesting. I also agree about not being. I don't agree about not being negative, because I think if I dislike something, I'll say if I dislike it. But I think for me, whether I like it or not is the least interesting thing. It's whether my problem would be, is it boring or is it interesting? And Doctor Who's never boring, because there's always something happening. And if it's interesting, there's always something to say about it.
And I think also,
my point wasn't that they're looking at it negatively. My point is that if you are faced with an answer, you can either look for that answer to make sense, or you can look for it not to make sense. So, for example, the thing about the passengers, David Kitchen's watching that bit with the passengers. And although he's seen that the passenger's empty, he's not registered that because he's looking for that bit of the story not to make sense.
Yeah, and
So
it's
it's
the
not
same.
that he's
And it's the same as the unit stuff. So I find it more interesting to accept that there might be a gap in logic, but to try and find a connection in logic. I'm not saying that that's the right answer, but I'm saying that, it's a more interesting conversation. You have to say things that are, you have to explore things that are interesting, rather than saying something doesn't make sense or something's wrong is like pulling the portcullis down on a conversation. Saying something doesn't make sense, and then exploring why it doesn't make sense, or why it's bad, or how it could make sense using twisty something, or why it's bad in an amusing way. That's where you actually get interesting stuff out of it.
I completely agree, and I think the unit stuff's a great example, because I think for a general audience, it's explained. Kate says, "Oh, I bet you it didn't even take you all that long to sort of go back and do everything you've done." So it explains that to the audience. Whereas Doctor Who fans are still probably going, "Well, why is Lethbridge Stewart being referred to as a corporal during the War Machines?" And they get all angry and frustrated because, the unit timeline is some unimpeachable thing that can't be messed with. And I do think for a show about time travel, Doctor Who fans are quite boringly linear a lot of the time in their criticism of the show. And I think that does bleed into what you're saying about there's answers there to be found, but people kind of willfully ignore them or take the kind of easy option that, oh, it just doesn't make sense, or, oh, it doesn't work within the sort of confines of the classic series, or something like that. It's an interesting thing.
There's a lot of sort of taking things personally, which starts to sound like I'm sort of, all cancel culture, but I've never quite understood. This is a character. I'm so invested in this character that if you do anything, I can understand it if you feel like you own the copyright to the character and you've created a franchise of books that you feel like you have ownership over, then I can actually understand that you would get anxious if something happens to that character, because it kind of invalidates your work. But if I'm sat at home watching James Bond and something happens to James Bond that I think, well, that's a bit unusual, then I can't take that personally, because that's egotism. That's saying that this character is for me, and this character isn't just a piece of fiction on the screen for everybody.
And we had that whole thing with Luke Skywalker as well, of course, in The Last Jedi. Look, this conversation could go on for hours and hours and hours, but as Mark alludes to, and as the listeners will have already heard, we did come here to talk about something else.
Well, I was going to say that this conversation could probably actually continue into that something else. To be honest, but
that something else is going out on our audio timeline first, so you will have already had the chance to hear it. It's going to be on this video timeline immediately after this.
Lucky people.
So until that happened, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Mark.
And we will speak again soon. That soon being now. So unless anybody needs to run off to the toilet or anything, we're probably going to be fairly quick on this.
Yeah, no worries. I just need to grab my laptop charger and then I'll be back.
Sure, no problem. Matt, you and I had better fill the dead air for the video. So, I don't know, have you seen anything else lately that we could just talk about for like 20 seconds?
I've seen quite a lot. So don't look up. I watched, which Simon was a big fan of. I've seen
you and I didn't especially like it, did we?
No, but okay. I refuse to burst Simon's bubble on it. So we won't talk about it. The Mark Cousins has made an extension to his story of film, which covers basically the period since he finished his old documentary, and that's really good, and that's a really good primer for sort of key moments in cinema in the last 10-12 years. So I've watched that. I've watched Final Destination 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, you should have saved those. We'll do them on the podcast.
Yeah, I know, but I don't think I'm going to forget them.
You'll have to watch them again, because the whole point of Film Club is
you just have to say, this is the funfair one, this is the car crash one, this is the aeroplane one, and I'll remember them.
We'll do it without you. We'll get Mark in instead.
Okay, probably for the best, because I'm not a huge fan.
Oh, the whole point of these conversations is if we all said exactly the same thing, there wouldn't be a lot of fun. Mark's back. Are we going to get into the second one? Is everybody ready?
Ready
Yes.
to go?
Okay. You're listening to Film Club Extra, and for the next 15, 20, 25 minutes, we are going to be 15 minutes, 10 minutes. We are going to be talking about The Matrix Resurrections, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I am Matt.
Hi, I'm Mark.
And so Mark is back with us once again because my suggestion that he becomes a sort of occasional guest seems to have all happened at once. And he spent the entire month living in my back room, giving Simon COVID and getting rid of him and moving into his shoes.
We've all seen Showgirls. We know how these things work.
Before we talk about Matrix Resurrections, we've just put out an episode about The Matrix. I think, have we all watched the two sequels before we watched Resurrections?
Yep.
Okay, so
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Mark and I both did. Mark, what did you think of the two sequels? One of them you'd not seen before, had you?
No, I gave up on The Matrix after Reloaded, which is weird because I watched it again and it's a lot better than I remembered. So I don't. It was maybe just the mood I was in at the time, or just being younger. I don't know. But I'm also kind of glad I did give it a swerve because Revolutions is terrible, just terrible.
Mind you say that you've just watched Revolutions for the first time, and the first time you saw Reloaded, you thought it was terrible. So maybe Revolutions is
probably not. I think
unlikely.
Because I mean, Reloaded. I think the thing that I got from Reloaded this time was I actually understood what the architect was banging on about. Whereas when I was a teenager in 2003, I maybe didn't quite get the kind of philosophical heft of it. But Reloaded just it Neo and Trinity bugger off for about half an hour.
Oh, I know. Yeah,
and it's just this incredibly dull, grimy cyber goth Star Wars thing, which is a real shame. It I think throws what the Matrix, what the original Matrix was, which is a treatise on reality and the self and identity, to just become a big freedom fighting war movie, which is a real shame.
Do you know, watching them again, because I watched them when they first came out and I hadn't seen them since because I didn't enjoy them at all back then. Watching them both back, they were both better than I remembered, but neither of them was very good at all, I didn't think. The second one I thought was a little bit like Damien Omen 2. In other words, it said, oh, people enjoyed the set pieces in the first one. Let's do more set pieces and shove some stuff in between. Do you know what really struck me about Reloaded and Revolutions is that from the start of Reloaded to the end of Revolutions, only something like 24 hours passes in the Matrix universe. That is an awful lot to pack in to just 24 hours. And that, for me, is not the reason there's a problem, but it's kind of symptomatic of the problem in that it felt like they had lots of ideas, but they didn't quite know what to do with them because the first film had taken up all the narrative. So there was no narrative left spare for the two sequels. And so, like you say, the two sequels kind of just devolve into this sort of almost narrative-free sort of sci-fi thing that just sort of sits there and occasionally does something really interesting, but very rarely develops it to an interesting place.
And I think opening up Zion and the world beyond the Matrix actually does it a disservice.
Yes.
Because Morpheus no longer is this revolutionary. He's just a cog in a military machine, which is really disappointing. And that's one of the biggest missteps I think it makes. And also just all the CGI in Reloaded hasn't aged particularly well.
Did you not think? I thought it was okay.
I think most of it's fine. It's just the fight scene with all the Smiths. There's a lot of that kind of early 2000s, which you get in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man films, where there is a slight weightlessness and the bodies don't feel quite real. They're quite ragdolly,
I thought that about the physical stuff they do as well, though, the wire work, because once you remove the wires, I kind of felt you had the same problem there anyway. Matt, at the risk of leaving you out of this conversation entirely, you've presumably seen these two films.
Yes, I mean, that's why I didn't rewatch them because I
did, and I
just didn't have the time or the inclination to. There were other films that I wanted to watch.
Shall we talk about Resurrections then? Shall we get into that? I mean, for myself, I hadn't really noticed that it was coming till I saw a trailer for it, and the trailer really intrigued me, because in the trailer I thought, oh, actually, if they're sort of going back and doing the sequel that they could have done back in the first place, but with that sort of 20-year interregnum, giving it weight and heft so that it actually felt like it could mean something. And I really liked the idea that the trailer seemed to be promoting. So yeah, going into it, I was really intrigued and actually really looking forward to this much more than I'd looked forward to any of the other Matrix films at all. Matt, because Mark's been talking and I've not really given you much of a chance yet, before you went in, what were you expecting from the Matrix Resurrections?
I didn't have high hopes, but I was looking forward to it because I think Keanu Reeves has got better as he's got older, or at least he's made films that I've enjoyed more. So I've really liked it. I've enjoyed the John Wick films quite a bit. So that combination, I was intrigued to see how it would work, not how they would round off the storyline or how they would resurrect the characters, because to be honest, I hadn't remembered what happened at the end of the third film. I think I was more interested to see how they would do something innovative for 2021 in the same way that they did something visually innovative in the 1990s. So what their version of bullet time would be this time around, because I think that's needed to be screw the plots and screw the philosophy. You need some sort of visual CGI hook for these films to make it interesting.
We'll talk about what they came up with in a minute, but they did come up with something.
Yeah.
Mark, though, what were your expectations?
Quite low until I actually saw the reviews come in. So I was like, yeah, I'll go and see it. You know, it'd be quite nice to revisit the Matrix. I'll watch I was fully intending, before you even invited me onto the podcast, to watch the originals again, but before going to see the sequel. So I was quietly intrigued, I think, is probably, because I think, like you, I watched the trailer and was quite intrigued by the premise. And then when the reviews started coming in, and they were all either panning it or saying it was the greatest sequel, that the Matrix could have ever done, really had me think, well, there must be something interesting in here then. If it's splitting people that much, I'm very intrigued. So yeah, so that was kind of where I was left kind of going into it. And also I'd just seen Matrix Revolutions about an hour beforehand. So my bar was quite low going into it as well.
So then, cards on the table, Matrix Resurrection. I kind of spent the entire running time wishing it was better than it was, willing it to be better than it was. I thought it was okay. I thought there was a lot of really good stuff in there. I thought it was a little bit clumsy and didn't quite hang together. And I thought a lot of the sort of exposition and characters was a bit distancing. So they brought in lots of really interesting characters that I quite liked, but the way they used those characters felt a bit distancing, so that I was never able to quite get on board with anybody. The new girl, I can't remember the names, I don't have the names in front of me, the new main character, as it were, who comes in, or she looks like she's going to be the main character, and she felt like she should be a really good character, and I really wanted to like that character, and I really wanted to empathize with that character and go with that character. But 15 minutes into the film, all of a sudden she gets shunted to the side for, Keanu Reeves to come back and for us to rejoin Keanu Reeves' story. And yeah, while I suppose that's kind of what you want in a Matrix film, the way she's shunted to the side and he's brought back to the fore felt to me like a misstep, because this either should be his story or her story, but it felt like it didn't know whether it wanted to be his story or her story, or whether she was the witness onto the story. And in the end, it all felt a bit clumsy. So as much as there was more in this that I liked than in any other Matrix film, including possibly even the very first one, I think this was better than the first one in a lot of ways. In the end, I just found it a bit clumsy and a bit distancing. Mark, what did you think?
I really, really liked it. I think
Fair enough.
I think I know what you're saying about. Is it Bugs?
Yes,
Is that her
that's
name?
it, yeah.
Jessica Henwick.
But I think it's kind of the point. The Matrix Resurrections is very much about the idealism of youth and what happens about 20 years later, or 40 years later, or whatever, 60 years I think it is in the actual film.
Yeah.
And it's that you set out to change the world, and then time passes and you kind of think actually you've not changed anything, but it's the job of the next generation to actually show you how far you have come, and I think that's kind of fundamentally what she's there to do, is to kind of revitalize Neo, and give them that
really
kind of second
that.
chance.
Yeah.
I think it's such a great concept, and I think also to kind of talk about, whilst not saying we dropped the ball on the sequels, just that whole, I don't know how spoilery we're going to get here, but that whole kind of
we can assume
pitch.
we can spoil because we have to assume that people have had a chance to see it. Yeah.
So that whole meeting where it's we're doing the Matrix again. The Warner Brothers wanting to do a sequel, and they're pitching ideas. Like what's the new bullet time, as Matt was sort of alluded to earlier. I think it's really good, and it is a kind of implicit suggestion that maybe they dropped the ball. Maybe you can't do a sequel to the Matrix until you have had that kind of 20 years between. Well, not quite 20 years, but I thought thematically incredibly interesting. I have to say, really, really enjoyed it. Yeah, I can see what you're saying. There is some clumsy elements, and I think there's some nods to the past that are completely, like having Jada Pinkett Smith back to be in latex as an old woman just felt entirely pointless.
I spent the entire film actually, and I'd forgotten to look. So now you've answered a question that I forgot to look up. But I kept thinking, is it her or is it somebody else? And I couldn't quite work it out.
Stuff like that. But then I think also bringing in Jonathan Groff and Neil Patrick Harris, I think, and also the years that have passed for Keanu Reeves as a performer, I think enlivened this a bit more as well. There's a bit more charisma, and I was just a lot more engaged with the world outside the Matrix. I think the cast characters on the ship were a lot more likable, and I had a lot of fun with it, to be honest. So there we go.
I thought Neil Patrick Harris actually was fantastic. But Matt, what did you think of the Matrix Resurrection?
There were jokes, which I wasn't expecting, and as far as I can remember, there wasn't one joke in the whole of the 3 original films. There's no kind of self-deprecating humor, whereas in this it was kind of. So I'm mixed on this. I like the beginning. I kind of like the postmodern stuff, but I think it was overly reverential. It depends on how reverently you treat the original Matrix film and how much you think the original Matrix film is this kind of important work of philosophical genius. Because I don't think that. I think it's a great work of spectacle, and I think the philosophy is kind of superficial. So
I'm not sure the film does either. This film. There's various things in it which I think point to this kind of idea of as I think we discussed when we talked about the original, is that you've got it wrong.
Yeah.
I think one of the first lines in it is maybe this isn't the story that we thought it was.
I think there was a lot of sort of meta referencing, but there was a lot of the original Matrix appearing on film screens in the film, and characters effectively masturbating to this amazing spectacle that they're seeing. So there was the original Matrix film is held in this kind of reverence within the film. It's not always uncritical, but it's still held in reverence. I think the whole meta stuff, this whole postmodern stuff, it is Wes Craven's new nightmare. And I think Mark Commode's pointed that out, but that's what I felt when I was watching it independently. And that was before the original Matrix film. So it's not, I think they're presenting it as we're doing this edgy concept, this edgy sort of pretending the Matrix is actually a thing and talking about sequels. Whereas actually in 1994, Wes Craven was doing that. So for me, that wasn't edgy. But I kind of I kind of went along with it because it was different and it was doing something. And I think Keanu Reeves was joking about things and his character was a bit lighter. And I found that quite amusing. I think where it went off the boil was when they resurrect Keanu Reeves and then it sort of turns into a bit of a chase in the end that wasn't all that, I didn't think was very well directed. I kind of lost sight of where people were and I became confused. And it's the sort of thing that Paul Greengrass say, even though he's like a choppy editor and handheld cameras, you always know where characters are. You always know where the chase is. In this sense, it was just a kind of, maybe purposefully, just sort of confusion.
There were a couple of edits where they said, we're going to go and do a thing. And then suddenly you edit to them being in the middle of doing the thing, but you don't get a chance to see which ones have gone to which place to do which mission. And so you're sitting there for 5 minutes trying to catch up with where the director's taken you. And that's fine, as long as it's not a confusing philosophical sci-fi fantasy. If it's a war movie, you don't mind catching up. In a sci-fi fantasy, it's a little bit harder.
I think also, I mean, the original Matrix, the action sequences, are one of its standout things. And in this, I think, as you say, Matt, the direction of the action scenes is quite clumsy. Like the fight on the train, I found incredibly sort of fumbled in that way that a lot of modern action sequences are. It is a lot of choppy editing. It's a lot of, wait a minute, who's hitting who and what's happening and who's going through the window? Are they a bad guy or again? It's a bit of a mess.
And it'd be interesting to line up that train action sequence with the Shang-Chi train action sequence, which is almost identical. But I think Marvel, like the well-oiled machine it is, clearly has specific action directors and CGIers that can construct this. I wonder if the lack of
unit,
now we're down one Wachowski, maybe that was the division that the two Wachowskis had. But having said that, I liked it. I agree with JR that I liked it more than most of the originals. I mean, it didn't have the freshness of the first film, but it had jokes in it, which I think kept me engaged. And I believed Keanu Reeves when Keanu Reeves was acting.
But I also think it was about something more than that first one was. The first one was a sort of existential philosophy thing as an action movie. This was an existential philosophy thing as an action movie that actually had a villain, and the villain was actually there to stand for something. And this is Lana, isn't it, who did this one? Lana Wachowski, wresting back control of the Matrix movies from QAnon and the Trump supporters, basically.
Yeah.
She's basically put a Trump supporter in as the villain and made it absolutely clear in the dialogue that that's what she's done. And there's no question of it. And I really, really, really liked that. Sometimes I find that a bit heavy-handed. In this instance, I didn't mind how heavy-handed it was, because basically I thought his character, and he comes in and it's subtle at first, and it gradually through the course of the film becomes more and more obvious. Mm-hmm. And by the end, I was really rooting for him to get a good slapping, to be honest.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's
does.
Great.
Yeah, he does. Humorously.
Mm.
I mean, this is there was a sort of a comic set piece of them killing him in a variety of kind of Warner Brothers ways. And you didn't get that in the original trilogy. That's something that's come in the last 20 years.
I think there's a bit of it in the first one, but I don't know whether some of that isn't kind of retrospectively imprinted on it. Maybe to a degree. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was definitely a film that had the distance to be self-aware enough to understand what it was doing in a way I think the first two sequels absolutely didn't. Like we said, the first two sequels absolutely didn't know how to be a sequel to The Matrix. I think this absolutely does know how to be a sequel to The Matrix. And I think it's a bit clumsy and goes on a bit too long. But shall we talk about the new bullet time thing then? Which basically is a version of bullet time that you can walk through and interact with, I suppose, is what they've done. And it took me a little while, because there's dialogue in the movie that says, right, what are we going to do for bullet time this time? Because they're talking about making the fourth game. And so that is reflecting what's actually happening on screen. So it took me a little while to realise, oh, that's the new bullet time, where he actually walks into it and starts interacting with it. What did we think of that? And did we think that was did that live up to the promise that they made in the dialogue?
I don't think it does, because you've kind of seen it in stuff like X-Men Days of Future Past and stuff like that. But also, I don't think it matters. I don't think Lana Wachowski is that interested in bringing some new technological advancement.
Yeah,
I
maybe
think
not.
I think it is about kind of addressing that kind of like, okay, the Matrix changed the game, in terms of action sequences, but also fundamentally it's Star Wars, it's all these other hero stories that we've seen 100 times before. Whereas this is very much like, it's about the pressure, it's about sequels, it's about, well, how do you bring something back and do something new with it? And I think what you actually do with it is you talk about. And again, that not even that is new, but you talk about how the film has been appropriated by the wrong type of people. It's a trans allegory that has been adopted by transphobes, essentially, is what the Matrix is, And
that was one thing I always really liked about the original Matrix, is that it's so much ahead of its time in terms of the diversity of its cast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just that whole thing of the red pill and the blue pill is an allegory for hormone therapy versus antidepressants, and I think this goes right into, that's what it always was. You have Neo popping blue pills throughout, seeing a therapist. He's taken the kind of easy path, but more because that's been kind of forced upon him.
Conditioned into it, yeah.
I think there's a lot more interesting stuff than the new bullet time, which looks like I say, it's not that new a concept.
Matt, how about you? What did you think of that?
Yeah, it was fine. I think it was Freema Rajaman in that pitch meeting. I'm sure I saw Freema Rajaman in the pitch
meeting.
Yeah.
It was,
okay,
yeah.
Presumably Sense8 and she has a Wachowski connection. Yeah, I agree that there's very little you can do now visually that will blow your mind, because you can basically warp time and space infinitely with today's computers. Looking back on it, I wonder how much bullet time changed cinema for good, because obviously that technology hadn't really been used again. The sort of the circle of cameras around the actors is very quickly replaced just with CGI. But yeah, it was fine. It was okay. But I get the important thing in this film is the sort of the philosophy and the message, and I think you can see more of that kind of personal connection, that kind of personal messaging in this film than in the previous films. I don't know whether that's because we know more about the Wachowskis now, or Lana Wachowski, because we've seen some of their other films. Having said that, I still prefer V for Vendetta. I still think combining the Wachowskis with Alan Moore, that's a really sort of potent mix for me.
Should we sum up and give it a score then? For me, like I say, I think it was a little bit clumsy and a little bit too long. It didn't quite fill the running time. And like Matt says, I do agree, it kind of devolved into a sort of standard sci-fi sort of chase thing for a while towards the end. That, I suppose had to be there, but kind of took me out of it a little bit. And I enjoyed much more when they finally got down to Neil Patrick Harris and the much more personal finale for his character, as it were. So for me, it's a 7. I kind of, like I say, kind of wanted it to be an 8, and I was trying to will it to be an 8, but it wasn't quite an 8. So for me, it's a 7. Matt, how about for you?
I'm scoring. I can't remember what I scored the original Matrix, but I think the 7.
Yeah.
Did I give it an 8?
I think so.
I'll probably give this an 8 as well, because I think it's definitely on par. I'd quite happily watch two films, the 2 films again. And the two films that exist, because obviously there are only 2 films in the Matrix, the Matrix cycle. But I think an 8 is fair.
Mark?
It's an 8 for me. I mean, I think, my issues with some of the action direction, and I think you're right, it does drag a little bit. But I mean, fundamentally, it's a great sequel. that I think comments on where we are now. You know.
Yeah.
So
Yes,
yeah,
I really
what more
liked
could you?
a lot
What
of that
more could
stuff.
you?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
more could you want from a Matrix sequel, really? So yeah, an 8 for me.
Right, Mark, you'll be back next week, no doubt, to talk about something. You'll be back on our feed in our very next episode, which we recorded just before we recorded this one. Until that happens, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Mark.
And we will speak again soon. And I shall turn off the video recording now.